everyone. So glad to have you back with me for our youth series on the book of Amos, part 2. Now, the book of Amos comes in 9 chapters, so we've broken it up into 3 parts, doing 3 chapters at a time. Today, we're going to focus on part 2, chapters 4 to 6. Remember that this youth series is meant to be done in a small group or with a group of people, some friends. Great to have a leader with you if possible. And because we're going to be going through some questions, and it's great to be able to pause this video, stop and talk with your group, and of course to reflect on things and pray at the end with your group. I want to do a quick recap for you. Chapters 1 and 2, God begins telling of some of the judgments that are coming on the surrounding nations of Israel, including Judah, and begins to tell them some of the things they've done wrong and how he's unpleased with it. Then at the end of chapter 2, he does the same thing with the nation of Israel, his chosen nation, but in this section, it's quite a bit more lengthy in tone, but also just in words, and God kind of expels a little bit more on Israel. In chapter 3, we understand why, because in chapter 3, God tells Israel of their coming judgment because they knew him. They should have known better. He had taught their ways, and they hadn't lived up to the responsibility that he had given them, and that there was going to be judgment, and that the Egyptians and the Philistines would actually get kind of a front row seat to witness this. Now, just to give us some context, let's remember that Amos was a shepherd, but God used him as a prophet in this season to look at what was going on. He saw what was going around in Israel and the surrounding nations in Judah where he lived. Now, Israel and Judah had split, Israel being in the north, Judah in the south. Amos was in Jerusalem or near Jerusalem in the south, if that wasn't made clear in the last lesson, which is going to be important for this lesson. But Israel in the north, God was not pleased with the things they were doing, and he invited Amos to come and speak to this. I want us to stop and just as an introductory question to get you talking, let's just ask this question. How should the church or the people of God relate to the world around them? Go ahead and talk together. And we're back. This is going to be important. We're going to continue to talk about how God relates to his people and expects us to relate to those around us in the coming chapters. Now, last week we read every word of chapters 1, 2, and 3. Today we're not going to do that. I encourage you with your group to read through the chapters, but we're going to kind of focus on some select verses that will kind of help us get the meaning, but you can dig deeper. Of course, this series is meant to just kind of give you an overview and just a small taste of what the book of Amos is about. Hopefully that will inspire you to want to kind of dig deeper in future days. So let's jump into chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 1 and 2 first. And it says this. It says, hear this word, you cows of Bashan, of Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to their husbands, bring us some drinks. The sovereign Lord has sworn by his holiness, the time will surely come when you will be taken away with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. So right here, we have Amos. He's not a traditional prophet. He's not a priest. He's not an elect. He's a shepherd. He's kind of rough around the edges. And when he says the cows of Bashan, he's kind of relating the women of this area as fat cows. He's insulting them. And it's not as though that they were necessarily all large fat, but they were symbolically fat. They were indulging in themselves. They were calling on people to bring them wine, and they were probably partying, probably living life up. And it had really become about them and satisfying their own enjoyment of things. And in verse 2, he's talking, and he says that they'll be taken away by fish hooks. And we know that some of the surrounding nations actually did this to people, that when they would capture them and they would take them to different places, they would actually stick fish hooks and meat hooks in some of their lips and some of their body parts to drag them as a way to humiliate them. Then I want to read verse 4 for you. It says this. Go to Bethel and sin. Go to Gilgal and sin yet more. Bring your sacrifice every morning, your tithes every 3 days. So what's happening here is he's talking about they're going to Gilgal and Bethel. These would have been in Israel. They would have been kind of where they had set up these these places of worship to replace Jerusalem. Jerusalem had always been the place of worship, but because it was in Judah, they had set up this new place. And what's happening is God is not happy with their sacrifice. He's saying, go to the temple or go to the place and sin, because that's what I see it as. And he says, bring your tithes every 3 days. Well, the reality is that they probably only brought their tithes every 3 months. But he's kind of saying, even if you brought your tithe every 3 days, I don't honor it because you're doing it in a wrong way. You're not honoring me, and you're doing evil things. Let's go to verse 7, and it says this. It says, I also withheld rain from you when the harvest was still 3 months away. I sent rain on one town, but withheld it from another. On one field had rain, and another had dried up. He's talking about God saying, because of their actions, they were actually living in just wanting to have all this stuff and wanting to take care of themselves, and they were offered to God, but it wasn't out of a justice way. They were doing a lot of evil things. They were neglecting the poor and a lot of injustice going around. And God says, I'm going to take away my blessing. I'm going to take away the rain. It's just one thing mentioned in this chapter that God's going to take away as a punishment for what we've done. And it says, I'm going to send rain on one field and not another. What he's saying is that they're going to run from place to place trying to get water, but he's going to take away satisfaction because they're not going to be able to find it with what's coming. Then in verse 12 and 13 at the end of chapter, it says this, therefore, this is what I will do to you, Israel. And because I will do this to you, Israel, prepare to meet your God. He who forms the mountains, who creates the wind and reveals his thoughts to mankind, who turns dawn to darkness and treads in the heights of the earth, the Lord Almighty is his name. He's saying that we're going to have a meeting, and I'm reminding you who I am. Right? So there's this call to kind of remember who they are, that there's going to be some some hard words if they don't get their act together, but also God is reminding them that who he is, that he's not somebody to be trifled with. I want you now to just maybe stop. Why don't you read through the rest of chapter 4 with your group, and I want you to talk about how sometimes people can get so caught up in doing religion that we forget about not doing what God meant us to live for and living really for our own self-indulgence. Great. God expects us to live for other people, to live for his ways, and sometimes we can get caught in cycles of focusing on ourselves, and we want to make sure not to do that. Let's jump into chapter 5. We're going to read the first couple verses of chapter 5, and this is what it says. It says, hear this word, Israel, the lament I take up concerning you. Fallen is virgin Israel, never to rise again, deserted in her own land, with no one to lift her up. This is what their sovereign Lord says to Israel. So essentially, Israel has fallen and is going to be captured. They have fallen into sin, and God is going to allow them to capture it. And this is what this chapter talks about. God begins to invite Israel to seek him out, but he says, don't seek me out in places like Gilgal and Bethel where they have no meaning to God. Israel didn't do justice, and they had kind of stepped on the poor, and they had set up these places of worship that were not honoring to God, and he didn't want them to go to these places, but he did want the people to seek him. As we move on through the verses, I encourage you to continue to read. Near the end, it says this in verse 21 to 23. Let's read this together. It says, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring your choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. So here we have God basically saying, I don't want anything to do with all these things you're doing to worship me. And it wasn't though as though God doesn't like worship. It's not as though God doesn't want our efforts. But what is being said here, and if you'll get this as you read the chapter together, is that God wasn't pleased with their worship because it was all a show. And what God is saying is that I don't want your worship if it's just to kind of meet the religious standard and just do what you think you have to do in order to look like a good person. He's saying, you come and you try and do all these worships, but you're forgetting everything else I said, all my commandments, all the things I've asked you to do, to take care of the poor, to take care of the needy, to take care of the oppressed, to put me first, all these things they'd forgotten. He said, if you're not going to do the things I asked, your worship means nothing. What I want you to do is I want you to love me and obey me and do the things I ask, and then your worship is meaningful, but you come and it's just an act, it's all a show, and I don't want that. I want you to stop for a minute and let's just talk about, as a group, talk about this question. How much do you think it bothers God to go, when people go through the motions of religion and neglect the poor, the needy, and the oppressed? Welcome back. Any of you who are familiar with the Bible and with what's written know that God's heart is for the poor, the needy, the oppressed, and for his heart for people to be reflected in people who follow him. We're going to read chapter 6, just some parts of chapter 6, and I want us to understand kind of where God is going with this. And this is kind of what it says. We're going to read verse 1 together, and it says this. It says, "Woe to you who are complacent in Zion, and to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria, you notable men of the foremost nation, to whom the people of Israel come." God is saying, woe to you. Big trouble is coming from Israel. You read some other versions, it says being complacent in Zion. Some it says being lazy or living in luxury. Big trouble's coming because Israel is sitting around living in luxury while they neglected the poor. What had happened is that they had a king that had brought a lot of prosperity to them. He had success in some military conquering, and as a result had set up some trade routes and all these things, that they were living in prosperity. But they made the false assumption, they assumed that the riches that they were living in was a sign that God was pleased with them, and that the poor people among them, the poor people of Judah as well, were undeserving of God's love and favor, that they were living in poverty because God was not pleased with them and God didn't want them. And if you read chapter 6, I encourage you to do this. That's not the case at all. God assuredly teaches them that he wasn't pleased with them, and that he was actually going to begin to rip away some of the pleasures and some of the things that they had because they had not pleased his heart. They had not taken care of the needy, the poor, and the oppressed. And that the poor and the needy and the oppressed had nothing to do with God just picking people that he didn't like or didn't think were following them to make poor. It had everything to do with the fact that the people who knew God were not doing things right. They were not sharing. They were not finding justice. They were not taking care of their communities. They were living only for themselves. Let's take a look at this question as a group. Just because we have a lot does not mean that we are right by God. So what can we do to make sure that we don't end up in a place similar to these people that Amos is talking to? Welcome back. Now, selfishness and self-indulgence is something that we're all in danger of falling into if we're not careful. It's something that every one of us can be tempted with. But God wants us to consider his heart, to look at the people around him. And I think this is kind of a big part of the message of the book of Amos. Now, I want you to take some time as a group. I want you to go through and recap some of the thoughts. Maybe read through some of the scriptures of chapter 4, 5, and 6 that we didn't get a chance to go through. And I want you to just kind of talk about the importance of Christians standing up for God's way and for justice and care for all. What does God want us to do in relation to the rest of the world? So why don't you do that? And then I want you to stop and I want you to take some time to pray with your group and reflect on things. We will see you next week for chapters 7, 8, and 9, part 3 of our series, where we will hear the visions that God gives Amos concerning what's going on. They're visions of things to come in very symbolic ways. And we're just going to take a look. We'll dive into them a little bit to understand how sometimes God spoke through the prophets and what it means for us in relation to understanding other visions, other books, but also just the message that was spoken to those people and how it can be used by us today. See you next week.